since I have a bit more slides than actually are gonna fit into this talk. So let's go. I'm gonna talk about configuration validation and specifically the road, how we got here, hence the picture, and what's in the future. So what is configuration? In Drupal, configuration is like all of the things that are your administrative settings, everything that can determine how a site functions, search API, indexes, fields, taxonomies, all those things. Validation is checking that's actually correct, that it's sensible and feasible and it can actually work. Why do we need this to be validated, our configuration? Well, I was talking to Wim Leers, who's actually from Ghent but not here, he's in America right now, and he told me in a Slack private message, so I translated it, because all of those things have one common target, one common goal. When something is validated in detail, we can be sure that everything is correct. That allows us to enable recipes, patching configuration entities, more reliable configuration split, more reliable deployments, more reliable most things in Drupal. So what exactly does that mean? Well, a lot of things actually. Our configuration import can be validated before it's actually imported, which means that an import does not break a site, that it can panic before the actual import and you get less, or hopefully no longer any white pages of that. More reliable configuration splits, because it can check that the split you've configured is actually something that is valid before the split is enabled. Regression detection in config, which enables automatic updates and also is helpful for your deployments. As well as recipes, which is the new thing and has been committed 3 or 4 days ago, something like this. I'm gonna talk about this a little bit more in detail, but not too much. And then JSON API, REST, and GraphQL. Well, this is a thing that already happens in Drupal and we know how that works, and that works really well. But the thing is, we can only do it for content, not for config. Because it's not validatable, we cannot be sure that what gets sent from somewhere else to our Drupal site, that it's actually correct. This means we can build a true decoupled admin. We can build an admin interface that does everything that Drupal does without actually having to touch Drupal. Why you would want to do this, I have no idea. You are going to invite a lot of work onto yourself and a lot of bugs that are probably not needed, but it's a thing that's actually possible in the future. And as a stretch goal, it could allow us to build a tool that can validate that the config that you're going to import into a Drupal site is actually valid config. Again, something that might be a little bit weird, but imagine that you have a very big config directory for a very big site, and you can validate that it's correct in your CI pipeline before you actually have to spin up a Drupal. You would get much faster feedback that your config is actually correct. So this is actually something that's really cool and on a very far horizon, like very, very far away. This is not gonna happen anytime soon, not this year, probably not the next either. So let's talk about some history. This is actually a picture that I took from the last time we had an event here. The rest of the pictures that will show up will be also from events. This is the very first time that we see something about, and let's see how the laser works there. So variable get, the first time we see variable get inside something that is Drupal, and that's a while ago. April 2001. No, I was gonna say if there are any of the students here, maybe you weren't even born then, but I see only people that are older than the birth year 2001. So maybe one of the people here was at this conference. Who knows where that is, when that is? No? Okay. This is Munich, 2000. This is again Wim, a very, very young Wim. He has now more hair and more beard. That's when we added file-based configuration. This is the first time we actually had something that is kind of looking like what today is our configuration management. A bit later, maybe some people will recognize someone sitting in this picture. This is 2013, the first DrupalCon in Prague. This is where we added a new configuration system. And what this actually does, and I'm going to try to zoom in on my presenter notes so I can see for the next slide, the configuration system will not change data types anymore. Before this, everything was a string all the time. You define a boolean, it's a string. You define an int, a number, a float, it's a string. From this point on, so somewhere in late 2013, it no longer gets converted to strings all the time, and we actually use the right primitive data types. This is when type data was introduced. So no conversion is happening either in storage or in retrieval of your config. And we no longer need to do, like, is this a boolean? Then we have to cast it to a boolean so you can use it correctly in your code. From this point on, we can actually assume that what gets back from the configuration system is actually the right thing most of the time. And then I'm sure that at least one person in the audience knows when this is. Eeks, do you remember? You're in the picture. So this is Drupal Europe in Darmstadt, when a service was added to configuration entities to make updating for them a lot easier. So we've already jumped a couple of years. We're going to jump again another year, and I see that Matthias is no longer here, but he's also in the picture because this is when we added the first config validation in Vienna. We added config validation for UUIDs. How does this look? Well, we changed the type of this UUID thing from a string to a UUID. We added a definition for that, which is actually just a string again, but it has one extra thing, a constraint. This constraint, UUID, means that it gets validated. We're using Symfony validators, which look kind of like this. Don't worry, you don't have to read the code. It doesn't really matter. But what it basically does is it validates that it's actually a UUID, because a UUID is a string with a special shape. You can't say that this is a different data type. No, the shape of the thing is important. It has to have 4 characters and then a dash and then another set of characters and then another dash. So this is something that's not just a data type, but a special kind of shape. And this shape validation is something that we're going to add more. So this UU validator that we're using from Symfony is going to allow us to do more of those things. Then, yeah, I was adding pictures of all the DrupalCons, and then DrupalCon didn't happen because the thing we all know happened around 2021, and we allowed for deprecating of config schemas. Then we're going to skip forward even further to this year, well, last year, 2023. That's last year, right? So that's where we're going to add more things. We're going to finally pick up some speed. We're going to do something. The first thing that actually got introduced is to check that a plugin that you define in your config actually exists before you can import that config. Because, for example, you have a view on your homepage. That view is called views.view.something.something, and you type it into your YAML file by hand, and you mistype it because we all know that typing, it sucks. So before this patch was applied, you could import it, you go to your homepage, everything is broken. There's no way to fix it except for going to your config, retyping the thing correctly, and importing again, and now it works. This is the first time we're going to actually add something to core. This happened last year that actually adds value to our daily life if you're editing config by hand. That's a small asterisk. Right, so there's another new data type added this last year as well, default line code. It's also a string, a special shape. It only has a certain amount of characters and only a certain amount of possible values. It can be an L, in, und, lolcat. There are different kind of, or is it lolspeak? I'm not sure. There's one weird language code somewhere in Drupal core. There's also choice, which is a really handy one because that's one that we're going to be reusing a lot of the times in new config schemas. This mimics a dropdown. all the possible values that you have in a dropdown that is fixed. For example, you want to have something, your nodes to be preview allowed or not allowed. This is 0, 1, 2 in the data. We can add a choice there that you cannot type for, because what meaning does this have? Nothing. Our meaning is important. We're also adding something called required label for a label that is required. And we're going to add stricter validation for config schema types. What this actually is one that I'm going to stick with a little bit longer, because we're going to add the possibility for a plugin or for a schema to define itself as fully validatable. What that means is that every single property in this schema has some validation. Without, well, some validation constraints if it's a string or an int. If it's a boolean, then it's either true or false, and you don't need to add any extra validation to that because there's no additional value you can add. But this part allows fully validatable config to declare themselves as such, and if you have something in your site that is adding a property to it without there being a schema for it, your site will say, what are you doing? I do not know the meaning of this. You're adding things that I do not understand. Well, it's not as anthropomorphized as this, but that's the meaning of the errors that you will get for this. And we're also adding the above validation of all those things in all the tests that Drupal runs. So this is one of the things where some tests started failing and people didn't figure out why, because they had weird, wrong validation. For example, at Calibrate, where I work, we have our install profile that we use on all of our sites. That started in 2019, 2020, something like this, Tom. And there used to be a property on the system.site that no longer is there, but we had it in our old config because no one ever cleaned that up. And sites started like crashing and we didn't understand. We deployed an update to Drupal and somewhere something didn't work. Luckily, this only happened on our local machines, not in production. We do the right thing. We test first locally, so nothing really terrible happens. But the thing is, we had configuration that was invalid, and our Drupal instance started telling us, yeah, you're doing something wrong. You're doing something I do not understand, which is good, right? And then we also added something called config target. Config target is a, as you can see by the pound sign in front of it, or the hashtag as the kids call it, this is something from Form API. This allows you for simple configuration to define the target of your config, which means you can throw away all your form submit calls and all your form validation calls. Who likes writing form validations? That's why I thought. You no longer have to do it if you're simple config, only for simple config. If you have validation constraints, you can use config target and everything magically, well, not magic. A lot of code and testing went into it, but kind of magically started working. Someone is calling me. I'm going to decline that call. But maybe one of the other organizers want to just try to reach me, who's the speaker, who's going to speak later today, and he's not arrived yet, so maybe someone should call him back. Sorry for that detour. Okay, so required keys. On a specific config schema, you have some things that are required, some things that are not required. By default, we're going to say everything that is defined here is always required. This is something that allows us to, like the same thing I talked about with the extra property being there from in our installation profile. If a property is missing, now Drupal will tell you, you're missing a property, you're missing something here. So this also helps. And this is what the fully validatable thing also does. I think a lot more people will know where this picture was taken. This time I'm not sure if anyone in the picture is actually here, but it's last year in Lille. So I'm going to start speeding up in the things that have been happening. So we've added validation to a bunch of things. We've made labels stricter. We've added new things as well. Notice no more pictures. This is from after Lille, so I just started using pictures from the city of Barcelona because that's where we'll be next time. And I couldn't find any more decent pictures of people. So we have added a config schema type for bytes. Bytes is a special kind of string. It has a certain 1 MB or 4 gigabytes or whatever. So there's validation for that as well. It can be used on different kind of things like upload limits and those kind of things. An entity bundle exists, similar to that plugin exists I talked about earlier. This is for bundles of entities. Like this bundle has to exist. If you're gonna show a view with only pages and you don't have a bundle called pages, then what is that gonna do? This helps, should help. A plugin exists validator that we added earlier is now added to relevant places, right? We added a list of all the places where we have plugin IDs in views, and all of those got helped as well. Many more places. This quote is exactly from the issue summary of that issue. Like many more places. Sometimes this is how Drupal works. We've added validation constraints to star.settings. I'm not going to add new slides for all of those things because that's a lot of extra slides, and I'm already on slide 32, so you have to not go too much into detail on all of those things, but all of those simple settings now have config validation. This means they are also defined as fully validatable. This means that they are done as far as core thinks they are. We've added constraints to core.date format, which is not a simple config, but a config entity. Also now fully valid, well, not fully validatable because that only applies to simple config, but fully validated. It has constraints to all of the things. Editor config schema is also now fully validatable. So you've heard me mention Wim a couple of times. He has done a lot of work on all of the config validation stuff. He works for Akia, and that's a target for them to get recipes. And since this enables recipes, Wim gets to spend a lot of time on this. And since he's a maintainer of the editor module, we had to get the editor module fixed as well. We've added the ability to specify a prefix to config exists constraints. We've allowed vocabularies to be fully validated through the API, which means that this is the first part of our true decoupled admin project that no one is working on. But that thing is now actually, we're starting to get there. The first one is in. We can do it sometime. We ensure that config that gets imported from a module of or a recipe is now validated before the import. Happened this year. Before that, if you imported something, Drupal would just import the thing and then let it crash if it happened to be something invalid. Since this year, this is actually something that we've, this year or late last year, somewhere between Lille and now, right? So this is a thing that we're working on. This is now working. I've switched up the picture. This is at DrupalCamp Davos, where Jens, who's also running around somewhere, is helping organize. I gave this talk there as well, so I added slides since then with this team. The config validation for weights. So you have a weight for your blocks and a weight for your filters and a weight for a lot of different kind of things can have weights in Drupal. We can now validate that this is between, well actually how would you validate that, right? What's the minimum value of a weight? Is it minus 50, minus 100? Is it minus the list of all the things you have? I don't know. What would you do? Like without having some good validation? Well, it can't be more than the maximum size of an integer, right? So this is somewhere between minus PHP max int and positive PHP max int. It's a validation. It will no longer crash your database, but if it actually is the best validation, I'm not sure. But actually it's better than having nothing, right? So we've added a validatable config test job to GitLab CI. If you do a lot of work on Drupal core, you might have seen this one complaining. If you add new config and that new config doesn't have some kind of validation, then it will tell you, hey, you're lowering the amount of validatable config in Drupal, don't do that, please. So this test job should allow us to ensure that everything new that gets added has validation. That's the purpose of this test. It's currently on allow failure true because it acts up sometimes and doesn't actually do 100% what it's supposed to do, but it's a really cool thing that should help us get better in the future. Because that's my goal for this thing, is get better in the future. And well, not actually, I think that's my goal for like most things, like ensure that I'm better in the future. So we've allowed config schema types to be marked without any settings. They are now fully validatable as well, right? So if you have a field and that doesn't have any setting, then yeah, there is nothing to validate, so we can just mark it as done. So type resolver, resolve expression. This is a really cool one. So type data is a part of Drupal that from your config actually makes data out of it. And this is typed in a way, that's why it's called type data. This allows for some magic where you can use parent, type, and key in those properties or in those schemas, and that will allow you to reference other parts of your schema. For example, you can say this plugin or this part of the schema has to be the name of another value. This is something that happens a lot with Search API. It has it everywhere. Like widget type will reference, it has its own schema, it will reference the type of the widget that you have selected. Those kind of things. Really, really helpful. But you could do, instead of parent, we've seen like a couple of instances where it was parent, and then nothing happens because it doesn't resolve. Now we've added, now it will yell at you and tell you, you've done something we don't understand. Like Drupal has started getting a little bit more yelly in the imports. Shouty, whatever. This is something that's quite interesting for recipes, is we can now allow a site to be installed from a recipe, but that means that we can actually install a site from existing config, and we don't need an installation profile anymore. So this means a site can now be installed from configuration without a profile, and you can just have a bunch of config and throw it at a site, run import, and it will import. Line codes, so this is a very, very recent thing. Line code is now only allowed on things that have translatable properties. Because currently a lot of things in Drupal have a line code, and they don't have anything that is translatable. So why do you have a Dutch version, and a French version, and an English version, and a German version, and a Spanish version, and I can probably keep going for a little while. Like, why do you have all those different kinds of possible variations of your config if nothing is translatable? It all has to be the same thing. So this is something that is now happening. So what's happening now? Well, there's actually a really cool page on Drupal.org which shows you this massive chart. This is a screenshot I took earlier today, and this tells us that we are 58% of object property paths, of every property path in every config schema in Drupal core is now validatable, or has now configuration validation. And relative progress is 37%. If we go back to here, this is the end of 2023, we were a lot lower at like 18%. So we've done a lot over the past year and a half. This is the past year of progress that we've made here. So I'm super proud of this. This actually, like the way this works is super interesting. Wim has built 5 minutes? Okay. I will maybe talk about that another time. Basically, it's a lot of Drupal installs and then exports and then seeing if everything is validatable or not. That's the short version. If you want the longer version, then maybe talk to me sometime else today. As of a few weeks ago, April 15th of this year, which was the birthday of our king. The half of Drupal's standard installation profile is now fully validatable. We're halfway there for standard, so almost halfway there. But we're making really, really good progress. We're getting there. Some things that we have to still do is untie config validation from form validation in a lot more places, which will allow the completely decoupled stuff, but also it will allow us to remove code. And I'm not sure about you, but my favorite thing to do is removing code and seeing that everything still works. That's the best feeling. Adding constraints to all the config entity types, JSON API post-patch support for fully validatable config entities. Those are things that we're still working on and that have been slowly progressing. This is a screenshot from earlier this year. I took this from a tweet that Gabor did. This is where we finally added recipes. The recipes API is now in Drupal core and experimental, so not stable yet, but you can start playing with it. We can start building stuff on top of all this config validation for recipes. So if you want to do this yourself, it's possible. You add types to all of the things, all of your config schema. You add constraints to all of them. You add config target everywhere. That's a simple config schema, and you're done. You're completely done. Everything works. My name was Yaris. I'm super happy that all of you were here and that you listened. You can find me here and on Twitter and on social media. And if you follow this tag on Drupal.org, you will find all of those issues. That was it. If there are any questions, I think I have a minute and a half. Okay, let's see. So the question gets recorded, right?
Just a very quick question. Is all this stuff available? You said it's committed to core, so it's all available in 10.3, 11,
yes.
Or?
10.3.
10.3, okay.
Most things are in 10.3. Some things are already in 10.1. Some of the things have been committed over the years and months. So some things are in 10.1, some things are in 10.2, some things 10.3. And hopefully we keep on improving in the future. Like half a minute left, Sven, I think. If anyone else has a quick question, then I can answer that. Otherwise, I think we're done for today. Okay, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference and see you later.